Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Marlo Payne Thurman with the US Autism Association, and I am here today with a really great friend and colleague, Raun K Kaufman, who is going to talk to us about an awesome topic that he's calling the neuro-crash. Hi, Ron. How are you?
Hey there, Marlo. Good to be here.
It's great to have you. So Ron is a true autism thought leader, and he's the co-creator of the Autism Crisis Turnaround Protocol. He's the author of the book, Autism Breakthrough, the groundbreaking method that has helped families all over the world. And he's the former CEO of the Autism Treatment Center of America. And Ron, I know you have a really great personal story too. So I'd like to give you some time to really tell us about kind of your other professional background, as well as kind of your personal ties and alignment with the field of autism.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you bring it up because this is such a personal subject to me. I mean, I've been doing this professionally for just about 25 years in terms of working with families and children and adults with autism and schools and educators and things like that. And before COVID, I was traveling all around the world to do that. But I have a really personal connection to it, which is that at a young age, I was diagnosed with what they called at the time severe autism. I had no eye contact, no language. I was very much in my own world, and I would do a lot of behaviors that a lot of us are familiar with. I'd rock back and forth, move my fingers in front of my eyes. I'd like to spin objects. And my parents were told that I had an IQ below 30, supposedly. And they were told that this is really what I was gonna be like for the rest of my life in terms of, I wasn't going to be able to really communicate with people. Actually, they were told I wasn't really gonna prefer people over objects. And then long-term, I wasn't gonna, go to school, go to university, live on my own, have a job, fall in love and get married. All that stuff was just not in the cards for me. And my parents did something so amazing in the face of that, which is they really turned their backs on those predictions, and they took me home and they developed their own home-based, very much child-centered program that they called the Sunrise Program. They spelled it S-O-N because that was their son. And they worked with me intensively for over 3 years. And I really grew and blossomed and transformed in a whole host of ways. Right now, I'm this guy. And I went on to graduate with a degree in biomedical ethics from the Ivy League's Brown University. Really definitely not what I was supposed to be doing. Actually, it's kind of amazing because everything that my parents were promised that I wasn't going to be able to do, I really ended up doing in my life. And, I did get married. That's my lovely wife, Dilma there, who I'm so grateful to be with. She's an amazing human being. And really, I'm grateful just that I've had the opportunity to do what I've done and live the kind of life that I would want to live. And so when I talk about autism and children and adults on the spectrum, I've been where your child or adult is. So I really know, number one, I really know what they're capable of. Number two, and then even kind of connecting to the subject we're going to talk about today, the second thing I really know from this experience that I've had is even if your loved one on the spectrum is behaving in a way that seems mysterious to you or really difficult or challenging to you, if you're a parent or an educator, I can tell you for sure, they're not the problem. And their autism is not the problem. And I would even go a step further and even say, this might be hard to swallow, but their behavior, no matter how extreme, isn't even really the problem either, because actually what that is it's the signal of the problem. And, for me, again, I'm grateful to talk about this stuff because I feel deeply connected to it. And I also really have a very, very healthy respect for parents of children, adults on the spectrum, because, my whole life was because of my parents. And I just see the love and dedication that these parents have. And so I feel very connected to that.
That's wonderful. And by the way, such a great story. And Ron, of course, you and I go way back through the US Autism Association, have shared a lot of panels together. But I have to tell you, one of the things that popped up for me in the last few months was like, oh, he got the term. And that term is neuro-crash, because it is so spot on to what that description is of those meltdowns. And I'm so glad that you're doing this because, so many of our treaters who work with kids with autism, like, well, I do this and this and this, but I don't do severe behavior. Or, I really know how to really help and prevent this and this and this, but, my expertise. And so there's not really a lot of people who have said my expertise is this kind of meltdown or neuro-crash type behavior. So I'd like to start today by just giving you a chance to really kind of own that term and give it your definition, because it's definitely yours. And while I'm a little jealous, I love that you're doing this. And I would love to tell our audience today kind of what you mean by neuro-crash.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, I just don't get sick of talking about it because I feel like it's so important. And in a lot of areas of autism, it can even be kind of a blind spot that people don't even see or maybe understand what's actually happening. So I'll just give you the definition first. I'm going to give you two, because in that definition, there's like another word I have to define. But basically, the neuro-crash is when the imposed situation, that's what I'm going to define in a second, when the imposed situation overwhelms the person on the spectrum's brain so that their coping mechanisms shut down. And I'll just define imposed situation really briefly. It's very simple. It's basically just the environment or the circumstance that the person on the spectrum is exposed to, usually without their say-so. But what's important about this piece is a few things. Number one, the way neuro-crashes tend to manifest can appear to a lot of neurotypical people looking at it from the outside. And that's important because the neuro-crash is what's happening on the inside. But then there's what people are seeing on the outside, and that often yields a misunderstanding. But that can look pretty extreme. And I understand people having a reaction to that. It can look like, it can be things like meltdowns, but it can also be hitting and biting and scratching. And it could be just a complete shutdown. It can also be things like, if they're more verbal, swearing at you or expressing high anxiety, and really having this, what some people might feel are kind of explosive reactions. And this is what gets misunderstood is like people are seeing it from the outside, and they're asking questions like, how do we change the behavior? How do we stop the behavior? That kind of thing. And what even the whole idea of a neuro-crash is trying to look at it from the inside and even ask different questions. Questions like, what's causing them to need to do what they're doing? What's their lived experience? And most important, I would argue, how can we help them get to a place of ease, comfort, relaxation, so that they're not in a fight or flight survival mode and not having to go through a neuro-crash? Because even though for people who are neurotypical, that may not be a fun experience to go through, I can promise you it's not fun for the person on the spectrum either, right? People talk about it like they're, and I don't, for me, this isn't how I think about it, but people talk about it as a very behavioral thing, like either almost like they're thinking about it and then misbehaving by saying, I think I'll break a window today or bite someone, right? As if it's like a thought through behavior, you know what I mean? And actually this goes to, I'll just say one other thing if I could, Marlo. This really goes to core aspects of autism and the misunderstanding there, because people describe autism in very, very behavioral terms. It's even defined in that way a lot of times, or diagnosed. People might look at, okay, there's stims or repetitive behaviors, there's avoidance of eye contact. And I'm not saying those things don't happen, of course they do, but those are behaviors. And to me, they're actually symptoms. And I'd even go a step further and say, they're not even really the autism. They're like the child or adult's response to the autism. They're the way that they're coping and self-regulating. And then unfortunately what happens, right, is people come in trying to help. No one's trying to be mean here. They come in and they try and redirect or stamp out the very coping mechanism that is the only thing in between the person on the spectrum and a neuro-crash, right? So then, but I will say this too, even if nobody's trying to stamp out those things, like even if you're letting the child or adult do it, which I think is awesome, still what can happen is the imposed situations can build up and still overwhelm these kinds of coping mechanisms. And then you can get a neuro-crash, which is why I think it's really important to start to look at, we are blaming the wrong thing. we're either blaming the person or the autism, but we're not blaming the imposed situation, which is the actual cause of what's happening. And so if we want to like change this dynamic, we have to look at that and say like, okay, what's the imposed situation that's doing this? And I'll just say a couple more things on this. I think it's also important for people to understand it's not really hardly ever is it a 1-to-1 ratio. Once in a while, but rarely is it like, oh, this one thing, this one imposed situation caused this neuro-crash. In fact, a lot of people often describe it as like it's out of the blue or it's out of proportion or whatever. And it's not, but people, again, from the outside, they're trying to connect it to one event. And what's usually happening in most cases is it's building up over the course of the day or the week. So there's a bunch of things that are beginning to move that person closer to a neurocrash by overwhelming their processing systems. And what's happening is it's not always that one-to-one. So it can be a buildup, which is also good news because it means if you start to take care of some of that, then often the individual things that they might be also reacting to, they can often handle that more because it's not a complete overwhelm. And so the last thing I'll just say in answer to your question is, this is where this misunderstanding of autism happens, where if I were describing it, I wouldn't describe it as those behaviors, although someone may be doing those things, but I would be describe it in a completely non-behavioral way. And I usually give three main aspects that often get to the heart for me of autism. One is a sort of social, emotional, communication, relational challenge or difference that's happening, but importantly, because of the way often neurotypical people handle that, it can lead to a trust deficit on the part of the person on the spectrum, which means the very person who's like you and the people who love them, who's trying to help them the most, is often going to get met with resistance because there's this trust deficit. So there's this social relational difference that's happening. Number two is something that Kate C. Wild and I she co-created the ACT protocol with me, that we call S4. It's just like a shorthand, and it just stands for super sensitive sensory systems. And the idea is, again, this won't surprise you, Marlo, you're the expert, but really this super sensitive sensory systems that lead to everything from what they're seeing, hearing, what's touching, what clothes feel like on them. And that ultimately, again, it starts to build up. A lot of times there's sensory input that for us seems either ordinary or even completely unnoticeable. Like it's easy for people to say, oh yeah, she really reacts to when there's an ambulance that goes by and there's a big siren or there's a thunderstorm. And I'm glad people pick up on that. But a lot of times there's much more subtle things going on that don't even register with us, but are overwhelming the S4 that's going on. And so that's the second thing. What I find is that when someone on the spectrum hits what I would call their sensory wall, which is sort of the limit of how much they can take of that, that's when you're going to get a neurocrash. And then the third and final thing is a really powerfully heightened need for predictability and control, partly because of the first two factors. But what happens there is that our loved ones really require a stabilizing sense of control that's often continuously disrupted and violated, again, with good intention throughout the day. And that builds up too. And eventually our loved ones hit their control wall and then they have a neurocrash there. So I just think it's important to understand that a lot of the behaviors are the reaction to or the coping mechanism for the autism. And so if we want to address the neurocrash, the problem isn't the coping mechanisms. That's actually part of the solution, not the problem. And the problem is the imposed situation interacting or ultimately clashing with this different way of being and perceiving. And that's what creates an issue. And I just think that's important because autism often gets described as what people do or do not do on the spectrum, when it's really more like how they are and how they perceive things. And so, yeah, I just think that's so important.
Yeah. And you know what, all of that is so true. And it's interesting because I think some people have heard my story. I don't actually have a personal autism background, but I have a head trauma background. And I think you talk about how in neurocrash that we all have it to some degree, right? In other words, every person on the planet can have this place where it's like, I have one nerve left and you're getting on it, right? But, I think about after and I don't think I understood this term completely, or even that whole idea of kind of completely hitting a wall until I had my head injury. And there's a story I'd like to just briefly share was,
Sure.
I was exhausted. We'd gone to a movie with the kids. My kids were pretty little. And then everybody was hungry and the kids were crying, and went into this restaurant that was pretty noisy and just started feeling over. And I was trying to keep it together, keep it together, keep it together. And the kids got these balloons, right? And they're got these balloons tied to their wrists, and we've got them in their car seats, or they're in their little car seats, buckled in, pulled out of the driveway of this restaurant. And that balloon was on my kid's hand and came back and hit me in the back of the head, a touch of a balloon. And it tipped me over in a way that I had never been tipped over in my entire adult life with my kids. And I'm literally screaming and having this kind of, meltdown. And it was so foreign to me. But then when I looked back on it, I was really very embarrassed. I was really very, chagrined. And I felt like, oh my gosh, I'm a terrible parent. But it was interesting because I've thought about that sense as how so many of our kids on the spectrum, it can be that tiny little balloon on the on the back of the head, right? It can be this tiny little thing. In other words, they're holding together, and it can be the tiniest little thing. It can also be a pretty big thing, but
Sure.
sometimes it's just this tiny little thing. Like, I need you to get off the bus, right? I need you to get off the school bus and walk into the classroom. That's just like that's my capacity. That is my wall. And I don't know that everybody has that true sense of the wall, like somebody who's on the autism spectrum or somebody who's had, traumatic brain injury. I've worked with people who have had, severe illness, severe physical illness, or who've had to go through, chemotherapy. In other words, there is a true wall there. And for our kids with autism, they're pushing their capacity closer to that wall than most people all the time, because it takes so much energy. Like you say, the sensory stuff, the kind of trying to fit into this world that isn't exactly perfect for me. So I think it's important to understand that there are some real causes. And then there's also sometimes just those little tip overs, like the balloon on the back of the head, right? And I think that's really what you're saying here.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Marlo, because almost any time that anyone, either on or off the spectrum, is reacting in a way that a lot of us might say is, wow, what's with the overreaction, right? Almost any time that's happening, it's not an overreaction, because it's not really, if you were completely fine and at ease and the balloon hit you in the back there, I'm sure it would have been no big deal. But so it wasn't like you overreacted to the balloon. It was that you just appropriately reacted to all the other stuff that was building up, and that maybe was your tipping point in that instance. And I'm glad you said that, because I think a lot of neurotypical people, well, actually, I'll tell you this, I think we're living in a time right this moment where there is more mass neuro-crashes happening among the neurotypical population than in my life, that I'll just say in my whole life. And I think that's why, how there's all these videos on YouTube now where like a flight attendant gives someone a simple instruction on an airplane and the person completely flips out, right? And everyone's like, oh, look at how someone asks something before they go into a store and the person flips out there, and people are attributing it to either like bad motivation on the person's part, or the person's just a bananas person, or like they're trying to be difficult and make a fight. And I think what's happening is, with all the turmoil that everyone's had in their world, everyone's getting close to their edge. And so there's a lot of tripwires being tripped, and people having neurocrashes, neurotypical people having neurocrashes, and just having these explosive reactions that, again, an outsider is looking at and like, what in the heck is going on here? And I think if we can understand that, we could have more of a sense of, first, compassion for all the neurotypical people having this, and then more to what I'm trying to focus on, a real compassion and understanding for what people on the spectrum are going through. Because as you were saying, their wall is in a much different place than a neurotypical person's wall. And because a neurotypical person isn't, let's say, necessarily a person with a head injury might have this, of course, but an average neurotypical person isn't having S4, a super sensitive sensory system. They're not having the same social emotional differences. They're not having the same, they still have some need for control and predictability. Actually, I'd argue everybody needs that, but not that heightened need that someone on the spectrum has. And so again, it's a lot of times they're looking at it from their own, where's my wall? And when someone on the spectrum who has totally different neurological experience and sensory experience has this, it can be seen with a lack of either understanding or compassion. And I don't think that's what anyone wants. I think people want to, I work with people, you do too, all the time. People want to understand their loved ones on the spectrum. Why are they doing this? So there's this craving for understanding. And that's part of what I'm trying to help people with. First, have the understanding and then have the actual solution. Because if you understand it right, then you can actually solve the cause instead of trying to stamp out the symptom.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting because you talk about the sensory kind of being that consumer of that energy. You talk about the social responsiveness. And coming back just briefly, my head injury hit my sensory motor cortex. So that was the thing that got hurt the worst, to the point that you could actually see on my imaging data that that's where I got my injury. But I think it's important to come back to that and talk about some of these there's like these underlying setups, right? So in other words, it's the thing that took the energy, so that then it's these few things are the things that are more likely to tip me over. And I think you have a really good list on that, Raun. You talked about in your autism crisis turnaround protocol, you talked about kind of these 7 variables that can be kind of these tip over points. And again, with the understanding that they're not the underlying, they're the iceberg, they're the part we see. The underlying is the sensory and the social and all these other things that have made this kid so exhausted and kind of at their wall anyway. But let's talk about those 7 kind of tip over points.
Sure. I would just as a note, slightly add to that or tweak that and say, like, these will often be those tipping points you're saying, but oftentimes what's happening is, I just want to reiterate that it's not the one thing, it's all the things.
Right,
so
it's all that build up, and then that one thing is the
building
thing
up all around. Right. Yeah, one analogy that I really like, right, is I've heard you talk like this too, Marlo, is like, so our loved one has a glass, it's an empty glass, and water's being poured into it during the day. And the water is all the different sensory experiences, the different violations of their control. And actually, if you pour a little water in there, it's actually okay. But what happens is it gets poured. And then when it overflows off the top, that's when you get a neuro-crash. So the idea is twofold. Can we, number one, pour less water throughout the day so we don't fill it all the way up? And then maybe, we try to do this with the ACT protocol, maybe take some of the water out. So these 7 things are major water pouring stuff, right? So anyway, I'll go through them. So basically,
by the way, that's a really great analogy, Raun. Thanks for giving us. I think that's a really helpful analogy for people.
Thanks. This first one is, and weirdly enough, probably one of the more overlooked ones, because it's such background noise in the environment, is being around, and this is from the perspective of the person on the spectrum, being around an adult, parent, caregiver, educator who is agitated. And I don't mean agitated like they just went for a run. I mean like emotionally agitated, because they might be frustrated, scared, upset, angry. Doesn't even have to be at the person on the spectrum, although that makes it worse, but it doesn't have to be. You could be really angry at your spouse or your boss or whatever, but you're around your loved one on the spectrum while you're feeling that way. And so you're raising your own agitation levels. And I cannot tell you, I know you'll resonate with this, Marlo. I can't tell you how many people will tell me, oh, no. I know that. You're right. I agree with you, but I don't act, I don't let them see it. Obviously, I plaster a big old smile on my face. No, I'm fine. There's no problem. What are you talking about? Right. And there's 100 different ways that it will leak out non-verbally that you can't control. So the idea isn't, when I think about it, the idea isn't don't act agitated. The idea is, can we help you not actually feel agitated? or if you are to dial it down, because I've seen this so many times. First, it's a vicious cycle. So we might get agitated, or maybe it starts with our loved one, doesn't, and then they get more agitated because they're having this sort of sensory assault in response to this. I was doing a session with a 14-year-old who was highly verbal on the spectrum, and he was telling me that when his mom is angry, and his mom was not like an angry person who would like get angry and flip out. She was just a regular person, right? She gets angry sometimes. So we all do. And he was telling me it felt like a tsunami, like this tidal wave hitting him, and he felt like he couldn't think, he couldn't function, he couldn't even leave to go do what he wanted to do. And that was even when she did her like just normal low grade, she was mad at something, you know what I mean? And he was able to express that. A lot of our loved ones can't express it in those nuanced terms. But basically it becomes a vicious cycle where, so then we get agitated, then they get agitated, then now we're watching this. So now we get more agitated, and then they get more agitated, and they kick into this fight or flight mode. And then eventually that will either contribute to or directly cause a neuro-crash. So we can turn that into a virtuous cycle though, by going the other way. So like when we start to go down, it helps them to start to go down, then we can continue to go down, and it lowers the temperature. I'm not saying it's a cure-all, but it lowers the temperature, and it's really positive. And then if you can, ideally, if you can even go through your day with your loved one and really just not be in that space, it can be powerful. We have something that we use in the ACT protocol called rise above questions, which are these sort of certain questions, which the idea is it kind of connects the current agitated space that you're in to like this deeper part in your brain that's a little more big picture, connected, thoughtful, and logical. And oftentimes that will then turn down the immediate sense of agitation, which is usually almost like what I would call like a small picture response. Someone's reacting to something that's going on right now, but actually if you can connect to this other part of your brain, it kind of lower this around. So anyway, that's just number one. Number two is being pushed. And I don't mean physically pushed. I hope nobody's doing that. I mean emotionally pushed. So there's a few ways that this happens. Number one, our loved ones' no's are not respected. I see this all the time, right? They're saying no, we barrel forward anyway. And by the way, it's not always a verbal no. Sometimes it's a verbal no. A lot of times, actually, it's a verbal no. But if they're not in a space where they're saying that, it might be they're pushing us away, they're moving away, they have a really clear frown on their face. They're like, sort of stop, even if they're not saying the word stop. So one is not respecting their no's. Two is trying to get them to do something. This is different than the no's. This is more like trying to get them to do their homework, trying to get them to sit at the table and eat with everybody else, that kind of thing. And then the last piece of this, which is, holy cow, I know you'll agree with me on this, Marlo, which is rushing. If you want more neuro-crashes, do lots of rushing with your loved one on the spectrum. When people are rushing, and look, I'm this way too when I'm in a rush, right? They're like, you know how we are. Okay, we're pushing everybody else, and we're also pushing ourselves, and our heart's racing, and it's like it brings back in that first issue, actually, the agitation. So that's number two, being pushed. Number three is invasion of personal space, and that also manifests in a few different ways. So it's things like unwanted affection, like hugging, kissing. I'm not saying don't hug and kiss your kid if that's wanted, but a lot of people, either they do it with their own kids, or sometimes they don't do it with their kids, but then the aunts and the uncles and the grandparents come in, oh, Snooky, I haven't seen you in so long. And I watch kids in this situation, and adults, they're like, oh, right? So one is that kind of invasion of personal space, even if it's coming from a well-meaning place. Two is if they're a smaller kid, picking them up and moving them. And by the way, the ACT protocol is definitely designed for adults and children. It's really not limited, 2-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 22-year-olds, 42-year-olds, literally. But some of this applies just to kids. Like you're not going to pick up and move a 25-year-old. But that can cause issues of even sometimes not touching them, of being too physically close, just kind of being a little bit in their space. And then, of course, the other part of this that I see people do all the time is taking their stuff. don't take their stuff, man. So like they might be lining up little cars, or they might have an object they just like to hold on to or whatever. And we're often, again, for good reason, taking their stuff, moving their stuff. And they're like, stop, I need this stuff the way it is. So all of that's just under the invasion of personal space thing. Number 4 is sensory overload, right? We've been talking about that, but that's this S4 is going on. And then there's just continuous, again, it's not always the loud sounds, although it's often those, but it can be lots of other things. Think about what it's like to sit at the dinner table. There's all the silverware scraping on the plates. There's the people talking. There's the chewing. There's throwing the dishes in the sink and that clank. Think of what showers are like. Holy moly. There's like you're inundated with water. Plus you have the smells of all the detergents. And then you have the slippery feeling of the soap. Like it's like a triple threat going on there, right? So there's a lot there. It's very easy to hit your sensory wall when you're faced with that all the time. Number 5 is unpredictability. And when I say unpredictability, obviously we can't help that the world is unpredictable, but we can help that we can often be unpredictable. So, think of the average neurotypical person. Sometimes you're annoyed, sometimes you're happy, and then you're in good mood, sometimes you're in a bad mood. You say dinner's going to be at 6, but you ran over at work today, so now dinner's at 7. Us neurotypical people, not always known for telling the truth. So sometimes we say something and it's not the truth, right? We change our minds. All of this is okay. I'm not even faulting people for it, but what it does is it makes you feel unpredictable. And that's another thing that then for our loved one can create this volatility in their experience. And then a couple more, blurry boundaries is a big one. So one of the things we feel is very important, so the ACT protocol has these 5 turnaround tools, these sort of 5 key actions and approaches. One of them is called ceasefire. It's actually the second one. And it has to do with completely changing the dynamic of control that's happening because of our loved ones' heightened need for predictability and control. And one part of that, it's only a piece of it, is it really creates problems if we have blurry boundaries. So one of the biggest mistake I see people make is this twofold, and this may sound almost contradictory, which is on the one hand, way too many boundaries, too many things. You're trying to control the person way too much, but at the same time, actually a softness and a blurriness on each individual boundary. Sometimes you enforce it, sometimes you don't. So what we recommend is actually do both. Way less boundaries, only a very few where things are like unsafe or property destruction, right? They're going to draw on all the walls or break all the windows, obviously. So there's some, but really just a few extreme things. Those are the boundaries. And then you have to be perfect with the boundary. You have to be completely consistent. And oftentimes we're trying to even be nice. Like, oh, it's Halloween. Well, you can eat candy on Halloween, or you can stay up 2 hours later on Halloween or Christmas or whenever this is. And we're actually doing it not to be difficult. We're trying to be nice. All that does is blur it now. So now how's the person on the spectrum supposed to get real clarity of like, is this or is this not a no-go zone? Like, it's not clear. And that actually can contribute to neuro-crashes. And look, most neurotypical people are just bad at setting boundaries with anybody, with their bosses, with their spouses, with their neurotypical kids. So this is hard for us. I get it. It's hard. That's why we spend some time trying to help people with it. But it's really important to get super consistent. We call them non-negotiable boundaries. They're not something you're even willing to have a negotiation on. Doesn't mean, by the way, you can't have a negotiation on something else, but not on these key few boundaries. And then the last one, which I think you'll also resonate with, is something we call biostorms. But I think a lot of people will resonate with that as sort of thinking like, a lot of our loved ones are having different biomedical and biological issues. And the reason we have this term biostorm is obviously biological, but storm is an interesting part because it basically means it's explosive, but it also passes. It's intense and temporary. And what often happens is it could be things that they're eating, but it's not limited to that. It could be dietary. It could be, they have more neuro-crashes on Fridays. What happens on Fridays? We clean the house on Fridays. So there's all sorts of now detergent microparticles in the air, and I think I say this to people like, listen, I hate to say this to you, but like when you smell something, even like you smell poop, Do you think you're detecting that by magic? No, you're smelling it because there's actually particles of that in the air that your olfactory receptors are actually detecting. So that means when the house smells all nice from being cleaned, what's happening is there's particles of Lysol and all these other in your nose now, right? So our loved ones on the spectrum are experiencing that. Even sometimes we've seen this happen with medications where they'll be on a medication, it'll actually be okay. It'll be fine for like 2 or 3 years, sometimes longer. And then all of a sudden, it'll start to cause biostorms. I've seen this happen a bunch of times. So that's the 7th one. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, and what you're really talking about is that when we're seeing these behaviors and we just address the behavior, sometimes, in fact, almost always, we're missing that really underlying component. And that's really what it sounds like the autism crisis turnaround is trying to get at. So we have about 15 minutes left. And what I'd really like to do, Ron, is just give that time to you almost exclusively for the purpose of talking about what type of crises are you addressing with the autism crisis turnaround, and
Right.
kind of how do you address those things within this protocol?
Great. Okay. So first I'll just go through it because there's 5 main, I would sort of say, types of crises. I'm sure they're not, look, I don't claim that that's all the crises that exist, but these are the ones that the ACT protocol can effectively address, right? So one is the whole umbrella of meltdowns, hitting, biting, screaming, swearing, those kinds of explosive reactions, right? 2 is lots of trouble in school. And I don't mean academic trouble. I don't even mean social trouble. I mean, there's sort of behavioral or disciplinary issues where the school's contacting you and being like, we can't handle this. Like, this isn't okay. Or maybe your loved one's already been expelled. I've worked with families like that because the school doesn't feel like they can handle that. So that's number 2. Number 3 is just constant day-to-day fighting with siblings such that it's causing lots of upheaval and stress in the house. 4, often overlooked, is expressions of high anxiety. That's not always going to be an explosive behavior. Sometimes it might be literally just a lot of anxiousness. A lot of people who are more verbally expressive who are on the spectrum will often say they're anxious or they're miserable or they're unhappy. And for those of us who love them, it can feel heartbreaking of like, how do I help this person? And actually what is often happening in those cases is those 7 things are just constantly overwhelming them. So that's why they're anxious and that's why they appear miserable, right? And then the 5th and final one is if your loved one on the spectrum just went through something. And what I mean by that, like the transition especially, right? So it could be the end of a friendship, the end of a relationship, a move, like you've actually moved, that's a huge thing. The death of a loved one, unfortunately, especially right now. And also the things like the start of puberty. I'm sure a lot of us can relate to that. So a lot of times there's a lot of upheaval when those things are happening. But again, even with those transitions, which are difficult and tricky for sure, it's way worse because those transitions are happening, but all these day-to-day imposed situations that are part of those 7 things are no one's trying to get rid of those or change those. And so, yeah, it's combining. And so, yeah, those are the 5 main areas. Now I say that because I don't want to try and pretend that the ACT protocol is all things to all people. I had someone ask me a question the other day about their loved one. And believe me, I've had this happen to me, so I can relate to it. In the Sunrise program, we actually call it button pushing. It's when someone on the spectrum like does something to kind of get your goat. So they're not having a neuro-crash. It's not because they're like freaking out. They like, I had a guy I was working with, his name was Dante, and I called him Dante's Peak because this kid was full of energy, right? And one of the things, he was trying to do something dangerous, and I was in a special Sunrise program playroom working with him, which is super safe. It's really hard to hurt yourself. But this kid was like superhuman, and he would try and climb up on these shelves that were already too high for him to reach, but it was incredible what he was able to do. So I would, I don't want to restrain him. That's not how I work with people, but I did. He was going to hurt himself, so I just kept. I'm a big guy. Luckily, I just kept blocking him. I just kept standing in his way and trying to sweetly explain it. He actually wasn't he didn't get upset with, like, he didn't like flip out. What he did is he just saw what I was doing. He's like, he walks into the middle of the room, he drops his drawers, takes a giant whiz on the floor, right? And he's really, so he knows exactly, because he thinks that I'm going to go clean that up and then he's going to get to go climb on the thing. So I was like, I'm not cleaning it up, man. So, and he just like ran back and forth through it, like covered the room with Dante urine. And my point is, in the Sunrise program, which is like a long-term developmental program, you know, people might be using ABA or RDI or Four-Time or whatever they're using. By the way, ACT is compatible with any kind of intervention you're doing. Those are long-term developmental programs, and those can be, let's say in the Sunrise program, there is a way that we deal with button pushing like that, where like, and where the person's doing it and they're like looking at you and smiling and laughing. It's not the same as a neurocrash, but that is like, for instance, ACT does not help with that. That's not what ACT is for. That's not what we're addressing. So if that's your issue, don't do ACT. But what I was going to say also about it is it's not a developmental program or intervention. It's a short-term protocol. So the whole idea is, we're not asking you to turn your whole life around forever. We're basically saying, learn the 5 turnaround tools and do it for 2, maybe 3 weeks. That's literally what it's 2 to 3 weeks. That's the turnaround time. That's the time it takes to really change this dynamic of what's happening, right? And again, we're talking about, we're not trying to teach that person to verbally express themselves or to be toilet trained or all the social skills that we might be teaching someone long-term in a Sunrise program. We're not trying to do that here. We're just trying to turn this crisis around, get out of this crisis, and ultimately get out of this, because what a crisis really is it's chronic and repeated neuro-crashes that are then causing a lot of upheaval and destruction for your loved one on the spectrum and for you. So we want to get out of that vicious cycle and turn it into a virtuous cycle. That's why it's just a 2 or 3 week thing. And then to also answer your question, if someone wanted to learn to do that, so Kate C. Wild and I, we spent a year and a half, just 7 days a week, really working on this. And it's a 3-stage learning process for the person that's trying to learn the 5 turnaround tools. So the first thing is they'd go to our website. It's called autismcrisisturnaround.com. But basically they'd go to the website and they would go to where it says step 1, and they would do it. Step 1's actually free, so people can just do it. You just, it's about a half an hour video where Kate and I kind of explain what's going on, kind of like how we're doing now, right? And then there's a step 2, which is like it's called the Autism Crisis Lifeline Instant Mini Course. It's just a go at your own pace. It's pre-recorded, it's not live. Go at your own pace online course. It has some really cool worksheets and these things called the 3 Lifeline launchers. It doesn't, in fairness, really solve the crisis, but it just sort of lowers the temperature and gives you some starting points to kind of tide people over to when they can get to the main event, because since the main event's live, it's not like happening all the time. And basically the main event, the purpose for which we created this is, it's called the Autism Crisis Turnaround Live Rescue Course. And basically it's a live course that Kate and I teach via Zoom, although eventually one day we're planning on doing it in person as well. And basically what it is, it's like an all-day Saturday and most of the day Sunday. There's a bunch of 2-hour classes, because each 5 2-hour classes, each 2 hours is one turnaround tool, and then there's like an hour break between each class. And basically the idea is we really show you, you're in with a bunch of students who are going through what you're going through, who can be like non-judgmentally supportive to you. But then from us, we're really trying to help you, walk you through exactly how to implement these 5 turnaround tools, and then spend your next couple of weeks or 3 weeks implementing it. And one last thing I'll just say about that is the very first thing, like in the first class, is teaching the first turnaround tool, which is called use socioception. And this is another term we came up with, but basically socioception is your ability, it's a skill, the skill or ability of detecting your child or adult on the spectrum's SOS, which stands for signals of stress, and detecting those before the neurocrash happens. There's a bunch of these SOS that people on the spectrum are putting out. Again, some are really obvious, if someone's going like this, but a lot of them are much more subtle than that. They blow by completely unnoticed. So when someone tells me that a neurocrash is like out of the blue, it's because they had to miss like 20 SOS first, 20 signals of stress. It's not their fault, but I'm just saying they missed those things. And if you can catch those things, you can circumvent the neurocrash before it even happens, but you got to catch those early. So, yeah.
Sounds great. And by the way, it sounds like a really great program. And it's, again, so necessary. And I run into, one of the things I run into is a lot of classroom teachers who are kind of, took their 1 or 2 courses in autism, and now they're in this special ed classroom. And they've got like 3 kids who are like really pretty often having a neurocrash, and they're very overwhelmed and they're very shut down. So it sounds like this would be a really great training program for them. So that's one of the things I would say.
I have a dream. I have a dream one day that that some police departments will learn it too.
Absolutely. And I was thinking about, the first responders. I mean, we have so much going on with the first responders right now. So, so short of signing up for the class and getting registered, which I would encourage people to do when, their district allows that, or when they're able to do that. And parents, obviously, this is a great tool for parents. And I'm so happy that you put this together, Ron, because I think, again, it's so necessary. But let's close today with just maybe some, like a few tips that you would say, okay, well, here's where I think you should start. Here's, if you're dealing with neurocrash behavior, here's some of the best tips I can give you.
The first thing I would recommend people do is start to get better at detecting signals of stress. Start to hone your socioception, get better at this. Again, I'm not saying that fixes everything, but it goes a long way. So I'm gonna say some of the ones that are less obvious than like ear covering and stuff like that. So one is, and by the way, they tend to be changes. So for instance, one of them that I have written down here is doing a stim or repetitive behavior more urgently. So I want to be clear, doing a stim is not an SOS. That's actually saying, hey, your loved one's coping mechanism is still alive and well. They're doing it, as long as you don't try and now stop them from doing that or interfere with that. But then what will happen sometimes is they'll be doing it and suddenly they'll do it with increased like intensity and urgentness. That's SOS. So it's that shift, right? Another one is saying no a lot. And again, we want to be thoughtful about this. If you're offering them a banana and they don't want it and they say no, that's not an SOS, right? But what you'll sometimes see is they start saying no to everything. Sometimes even things they like, right? That's an SOS. That's like, hey, I'm getting real. That water in the cup is getting super close to the edge there, right? So you have to say no. Get anything where they start getting really controlling of what you do, what you say, what you don't say, how you move, repeatedly asking the same question or wanting the same answer in an intense way, right? All of that's SOS. You can start to look for things like tightening facial muscles, like clenching jaw, tightening around here. Again, this takes some subtlety, but people can get really good at this if they focus on it. Breathing pattern changes, like slightly faster breathing. Another big one I see a lot is clenched fists, and I don't mean like clenched fists to hit. Once that's happening, we're in the neurocrash zone. But like oftentimes the fists will just be clenched or will keep clenching while the hands are at their sides, so they're not waving their fists around. Hitting, this is another one too. Hitting, again, not hitting other people where we've crossed over, but like they've started like hitting themselves or picking at their skin or biting themselves. That's like, okay, we're getting close here. So one of the big things is like start to notice these kinds of things. And even though I can't explain everything to do with that, at least do this. Start to notice it. And then when you notice it, like immediately back off from whatever you're doing. Right? Give them some space, give them control of whatever, like the immediate environment. That's at least going to help. That's at least going to help. The other things, really pay attention, like I said before, to your agitation levels. The more you can stay relaxed, that's really important, actually, for the person around the person on the spectrum. Super important. So there are some things you can do there. I just want to think in terms of another tip. Oh, don't forget, this is one of the last things we talk about in the course. Don't forget about all the space between the crises and between the neurocrashes, because that's the time where you can start to address the trust deficit, where you can build the kind of relationship that has the kind of resilience that is then better able to withstand neurocrashes or even sometimes circumvent them. We have something that we teach in the course called the autism love languages. So obviously, you know, the best-selling book about love languages, which is like for relationships. This is about how we can convey support, caring, and relating to someone on the spectrum in a language that they can understand. Because the thing is no one's helping these people in a way that feels like helps them. Lots of people are helping them, right? And lots of people are loving them, but no one's helping them in a way that feels like help or loving them in a way that feels like love. And I don't mean this literally no one, of course, lots of people are, but I'm saying oftentimes it's not translating going in. So we then talk about, okay, when you're not in the middle of a neuro crash, that's a time to start to build this piece up, this trust, this relationship by using these 5 autism love languages to sort of create connection, which are things, everything from words of support to interest in their interests, meaning actually caring about what they care about, to like trying to serve them. I know that sounds funny, but like if they like foot squeezes, giving them a lot of that. And so doing different things that are going to translate and help them feel like, hey, this person's my ally and supporter, which is going to help you down the line when you start to get close to a neuro crash.
Absolutely. And by the way, really great takeaways, Ron. So thank you for that. It's interesting. When I talk to adults with autism, they all kind of communicate that I know when you're being authentic, and I know when I can tell when you're really stressed versus when you've got that smile on your face saying I'm okay. So I think, and I'm sure you would agree with this, part of that is being in touch with yourself and being authentic with the person you're dealing with, which ties to all that relationship stuff as well.
So. Oh, and can I say this real quick?
Yeah.
Because this is such a good point you're bringing up. People talk, this is another thing I hear that I feel like gets us really far off track, which is people talk about that people on the spectrum don't have empathy and they have the mind blindness. And so they don't understand what anyone's feeling and blah. And yeah, they have relational differences, of course, but I will tell you, this is what I found in my own life. It's way easier for me to act, if I'm having a tough time, for me to act happy and fool a neurotypical person, way easier than it is for me to do that with someone on the spectrum. Person on the spectrum is actually much more likely to pick up on all my little subtle things that are like, oh, I'm not really having such a good time right now. I am struggling, or I am stressed, or I am whatever. And I would argue that they actually have a heightened awareness of these kinds of little signals that we put out.
I would agree completely. And I think we've got some other speakers who have talked about that. So I think in the future, we're maybe going to actually see some data come on that. So Ron, thank you so much. For everyone who's listening, we're with Raun K Kaufman, and we're talking about neuro crash. And I was so happy to be able to do this with you today. So thank you so much for your time. It was awesome.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you very much.
And I look forward to seeing everyone again soon. Thanks.